Next in our study on women of the Bible. This week we're returning to the Old Testament and looking at one woman and then a series of women associated with King Solomon, David's son, and the third king of Israel. The first woman that we're looking to is the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba not only possessed a great position and influence, but also enormous wealth and possessions. Not willing to rely on the reports about Solomon's wisdom and wealth from others, she was eager to see him for herself. Accompanied by a great retinue, she made her exhausting trip through hundreds of miles of desert to Jerusalem. Finally, she was face to face with wise Solomon. There she opened before him all that was in her heart. Sheba, about 1,400 miles south of Jerusalem, was a land with influence extending throughout the ancient world. Since Sheba's considerable economy was dependent on worldwide overland spice trade, Israel's activities, power, and location must have been of particular interest to the Queen and her caravans. Solomon, with the assistance of Hiram, king of Tyre, had begun to undertake sailing expeditions to Ophir from the newly established seaport of Ezion-Geber. You can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 9 and verses 26 to 28, also 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 11. This newly created trade alliance may have been the cause of some concern to the Queen of Sheba. The Queen's visit was not based merely on curiosity or admiration for the King of Israel. The exchange of gifts is evidence that negotiations were probably a part of her agenda with Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 10 and verses 10 and 13 seem to suggest this. The Queen of Sheba is significant, however, not just for her economic or political accomplishments, but for her reaction to the King of Israel. This woman with enormous wealth and wisdom of her own was overwhelmed by the magnificence of Solomon's wisdom and wealth. In response, she broke forth in highest praise to Solomon's God. Perhaps the greatest tribute to the Queen of Sheba came from the mouth of Jesus, Matthew chapter 12 and verse 42. A godless queen came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and she praised God. The godly, in inverted commas, perhaps better described as religious Pharisees, needed only to look upon the one already standing before them to see the wisdom of God. But they would not see him. The Queen's example stands as a sharp rebuke against the Pharisees and leaves us with a question for ourselves. How much are we willing to pursue the wisdom of God? It's an interesting question in light of the second lot of women that we're looking at today, and that is Solomon's pagan wives. Clearly, women influenced and dramatically altered the life and career of Israel's King Solomon. He ascended the throne when the nation was at its peak of power, free from external threats and well organized internally. His great wealth, extraordinary wisdom, and unparalleled understanding of life catapulted him to the peak of international prominence. During Solomon's reign, however, Israel began to unravel because of his disobedience. Disobedience primarily in one area, his multiple marriages to foreign women. The use of the conjunction but in, say, 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 1 highlights his folly and shows his disregard of the Mosaic warning from God against marriage to idolaters. See Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verses 1 to 4, or Deuteronomy 17:17. In the royal harem, quite famously, appeared 700 wives and 300 concubines. Solomon's callousness toward the Lord seems to have grown in proportion to his addiction to women. See 1 Kings 11 and verse 9. Some of Solomon's marriages were political moves. The king was forming alliances with neighboring countries. He married Pharaoh's daughter, 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 1, and built a palace for her. He received the city of Giza as her dowry, 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 16, guaranteeing Egypt's friendship. However, he continued to marry foreign wives long after the political need was past. These women were idolaters, worshipping Ashtoreth, the fertility goddess, whose worship included sacred prostitution, and Molech, whose worship sometimes involved child sacrifice. Solomon himself penned the wisdom of monogamy. For instance, Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 9. The writer of Proverbs warned vigorously against adultery. Proverbs chapter 5, for instance. Yet Solomon allowed these very violations of God's law to be his undoing. His wives encouraged Solomon to build shrines to their foreign gods in Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verses 15 to 20. Eventually destroying and dispersing the nation. Not only was Solomon led astray personally, but also his entire family was corrupted because his children were not taught to follow God's laws. The difference, the distance between the writer of Proverbs and the practice of Solomon's later life is stark and serves as a stark warning to each and every one of us. Thanks very much.